The stars had always called to humanity with promises of wonder and friendship. Captain Danny Morris stood on the bridge of the UES horizon and watched those stars with hope in his heart. Beside him stood Ambassador Lisa Grant, a woman who had spent her entire career preparing for this moment. They were about to meet another intelligent species for the first time in human history. The year was 2387 and everything was about to change. The Keltharian ships appeared on their sensors like silver daggers cutting through the darkness of space. They were beautiful in a way that made Danny hold his breath. Massive vessels that dwarfed the horizon moved with grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Lisa touched his shoulder gently and smiled. This was what they had dreamed about since childhood, what humanity had reached for since the first rocket pierced Earth's atmosphere. The first communications were peaceful. The Keltharians spoke through translators in voices that sounded like wind chimes. They welcomed humanity to the galactic community and spoke of trade, culture, and cooperation. Lisa led the talks with skill and patience. She offered friendship and partnership between equals. The Keltharian ambassador, a being named Thelvar, seemed to agree with everything she said. Danny watched the exchanges and felt pride in his species. Humans had finally found their place among the stars, but something changed in the second week of talks. Thelvar began using different words. He spoke of guidance instead of partnership. He mentioned protection instead of cooperation. When Lisa asked for clarification, the Keltharian's tone shifted to something that sounded almost amused. They had misunderstood, he explained. Humanity was too young, too primitive to stand as equals. Earth would need to accept Keltharian oversight. It would be for their own good. Lisa's face remained calm, but Danny saw her hands tighten on the armrest of her chair. She explained politely but firmly that humanity sought friendship between equals, not a relationship of master and student. Earth had traveled to the stars on their own merit and would maintain their sovereignty. Thelvar's response came after a long pause. The Keltharians would give humanity time to reconsider their position. Then the communication ended abruptly. Danny took the horizon back to Earth with a feeling of unease growing in his gut. Something about the way Thelvar had spoken in those final moments bothered him. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was the tone someone used when dealing with a child who didn't understand the world yet. Lisa spent the journey writing her report in silence. When Danny asked her opinion, she looked at him with tired eyes and said they would need to be very careful in the months ahead. Earth's United Council received their report with mixed reactions. Director Karen Hughes, the elected leader of humanity's unified government, listened to every word with growing concern. She was a woman who had built her career on diplomacy and peaceful resolution. The idea that their first contact might turn hostile made her voice shake slightly as she asked questions. Some council members argued for acceptance of Keltharian terms. Better to have protection than to stand alone in a dangerous galaxy. Others demanded Earth maintain its independence no matter the cost. Karen called for patience and continued dialogue. She authorized the construction of more exploration ships and quietly ordered the military to begin updated defensive protocols. It was a precaution, she told herself, just in case. Meanwhile, she sent diplomatic teams back to Keltharian space with offers of compromise. Perhaps there was a middle ground where both species could find satisfaction. The Keltharians responded by blockading the human colony of New Boston. Their ships appeared in orbit and declared that no vessels would enter or leave without Keltharian inspection. The colony had 15,000 people who depended on regular supply shipments. Karen protested through every diplomatic channel available. The Keltharians replied that this was for humanity's protection. There were dangerous elements in the galaxy, and Earth's ships were not equipped to recognize them. The blockade would continue until humanity agreed to proper oversight. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was stationed on New Boston when the blockade began. He was a young officer fresh from the academy with dreams of exploring uncharted systems. Instead, he watched Keltharian warships circle overhead like vultures. His sister Amy lived on the colony with her husband and 2 young daughters. She worked in the agricultural domes that fed the population. Jake visited her when his duties allowed and tried to hide his worry. Amy saw through him easily. She had always been able to read her little brother. The blockade lasted 3 months. Supply ships were turned away or stripped of their cargo after humiliating inspections. The Keltharians went through everything looking for what they called contraband. Medicines, farming equipment, children's toys, all were examined and often confiscated, for reasons that made no sense. Jake watched the colony's supplies dwindle and felt helpless. His military training had prepared him for many things, but not for this slow suffocation of an entire community. Karen Hughes negotiated without rest during those months. She offered economic partnerships, cultural exchanges, and scientific cooperation. She agreed to information sharing and joint exploration missions. The Keltharians accepted each offer and then added new demands. They wanted access to Earth's military installations for inspections. They wanted approval rights over which systems humanity could explore. They wanted representatives in Earth's government with voting power on major decisions. Each concession from Earth was met with another demand. Jake received orders to evacuate all military personnel from New Boston. The colony itself would remain under blockade, but Earth wanted its soldiers back home. He argued with his commanding officer, but orders were orders. The night before he left, Amy made dinner for his crew. Her daughters, ages 6 and 8, drew pictures of Jake's ship for him to take along. They asked when the bad aliens would leave. Jake promised them it would be soon. He hated lying to children. Back on Earth, Jake reported to the military command center in Geneva. The building hummed with activity that seemed barely controlled. Officers moved with purpose, but Jake could see frustration in every face. Admiral Peter Blake reviewed his report from New Boston and asked pointed questions about Keltharian ship movements and capabilities. Jake answered everything he could and then asked a question of his own. Were they preparing for war? Blake looked at him for a long moment before answering. They were preparing for whatever came next. 15 years passed in this strange state of tension. The Keltharians increased pressure slowly, like a vice tightening by degrees. They blockaded more colonies. They intercepted trade ships. They established patrol zones in space that had been open to human travel. Each action was explained as necessary for humanity's protection, or as enforcement of galactic laws that no one had told Earth existed. Karen Hughes continued diplomatic efforts with determination that others called stubbornness. She refused to give up on peace. Jake rose through the ranks during those years. He became known as an officer who could think creatively under pressure. His service record filled with commendations for resolving difficult situations without violence. But inside, anger grew that he worked hard to control. He watched humanity bend over backward to avoid conflict while the Keltharians grew bolder. He attended meetings where they discussed giving up colony rights or restricting human expansion. Each concession felt like swallowing glass. The Keltharians finally made their ultimate demand in the 15th year. They wanted 3 colonies handed over completely. New Boston, New Virginia, and Terra Verde would become Keltharian protectorates. The human populations would be allowed to stay, but under alien governance. This was presented as a reparation for violations of space law. When Earth's diplomats asked what violations, the Keltharians provided a list of technical infractions that seemed designed specifically to be impossible to avoid. Karen Hughes called an emergency session of the United Council. She was older now, and the years of stress showed in lines on her face. She presented the Keltharian demands and asked for guidance. The chamber erupted in argument. Some counselors said they had no choice but to comply. Others demanded they refuse and face whatever consequences came. Karen listened to every voice and then asked for 48 hours to compose Earth's response. She wanted to try one more avenue of negotiation. The council granted her request. The Keltharians didn't wait for an answer. 30 hours after making their demand, their warships opened fire on New Virginia. The colony had a population of 40,000. Most were farmers who had come to terraform a difficult world into something beautiful. They had schools and parks and dreams of the future. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. When it ended, New Virginia was a crater. Rescue ships found no survivors. Jake Morrison learned about the attack while training new pilots at the academy. Someone turned on the news feed and the room went silent. The reporters struggled to describe what they were seeing. Satellite footage showed the destruction in horrific detail. Jake felt the world tilt beneath him. Amy had transferred to New Virginia 2 years ago. She said the opportunities were better there. Her daughters would have been 9 and 11 now. He tried to call her Comlink. There was no answer. There would never be an answer again. Earth wept. Every news channel showed the same images. Every social media feed filled with names of the dead. Memorial services began before the final count was even complete. People gathered in public squares and cried together. Karen Hughes appeared before the United Nations Assembly in New York. The chamber was packed beyond capacity. She stood at the podium with red eyes and a voice that shook but never broke. She spoke for 2 hours. She detailed every diplomatic attempt over 15 years. She listed every concession Earth had made. She described every effort to find peaceful resolution. She showed recordings of negotiations where humanity had begged for understanding. She played audio of Keltharian promises that had been broken within days. When she finished recounting the history, she paused and looked directly into the cameras. Her next words were spoken quietly, but they carried through the chamber and across every screen on Earth. We tried peace. We offered friendship and were answered with cruelty. We sought compromise and were met with demands. We extended our hand and they cut it off. For 15 years we have bent and yielded and hoped. 40,000 people died yesterday because we believed peace was possible, with those who see only weakness and mercy. She paused again and her voice grew colder. We tried peace. Now you'll meet the other side of humanity. The silence that followed Karen Hughes' speech lasted only seconds before the chamber erupted, not in debate or argument, but in unified resolve. Representatives from every nation stood and spoke in turn. Each voice carried the same message. No more negotiations. No more concessions. No more patience. The vote was unanimous. Earth was going to war. Jake Morrison received his new orders within hours of the declaration. He was promoted to commander and given his first ship command. The UES Vengeance was a destroyer fresh from the shipyards, equipped with weapons systems that had existed only as classified blueprints until now. Jake walked through its corridors and felt the newness of everything. The ship still smelled of construction and possibility. His crew reported aboard over the next 2 days. Every single person had volunteered. Every single person had lost someone on New Virginia. Lieutenant Nicole Hayes was assigned as his first officer. She arrived with a service record that impressed Jake and eyes that told a harder story. Her husband had been an agricultural engineer on New Virginia. They had been married for 3 years. She spoke about him once during their first week together, and then never mentioned him again. Jake understood. Some pain was too large for words. They both threw themselves into preparing the Vengeance for combat. Admiral Peter Blake took command of what Earth was calling the First Fleet. It was the largest military formation humanity had ever assembled. 200 ships of various classes all brought together with a single purpose. Blake was an older man who had served in Earth's defense forces for 40 years, without ever seeing real combat. Now he would lead humanity's first interstellar war. He spent his days studying reports and his nights reviewing tactical simulations. Sleep became something he did when exhaustion forced him to. Scientists across Earth received authorization to open sealed projects. Dr. Helen Carter had spent 20 years working on theoretical weapons that she hoped would never be needed. Now her laboratory hummed with activity as theories became reality. She led a team of 500 researchers who worked around the clock. They developed stealth systems that could hide a ship from almost any sensor. They created weapons that violated several treaties Earth had proposed for peaceful space exploration. Helen felt sick every time she approved another prototype, but she kept working. The Keltharians had made this necessary. The military mobilized with efficiency that surprised even its own leadership. Reservists reported to duty. Training programs accelerated. Factories that had built civilian ships retooled for military production. Earth's economy shifted into war footing within weeks. People accepted rationing without complaint. They donated money and resources. Parents sent their children to the military academies with pride and terror mixed together. The entire species moved with unified purpose. Jake took the Vengeance out for its first combat patrol 3 weeks after receiving command. His orders were to sweep the asteroid belt near the colony of New Dallas and eliminate any Keltharian presence. Intelligence suggested a small observation post had been established there. Jake's crew worked their stations with nervous energy. This would be their first real engagement. He could feel the tension on the bridge like static electricity before a storm. They found the Keltharian post exactly where intelligence predicted. It was a small facility built into a large asteroid, probably housing no more than 20 aliens. Jake ordered a full scan before approaching. The facility had sensors and communications, but no significant weapons. It was clearly designed for observation rather than combat. Nicole looked at him with a question in her eyes. This would be easy. Almost too easy. Jake made his decision quickly. He opened a communication channel. The Keltharians responded with confusion when Jake identified himself. They seemed genuinely surprised that a human warship was in the area. The post commander, whose name translated as Velkun, asked what they wanted. Jake's response was simple and cold. He gave them 10 minutes to evacuate the facility and surrender. After that, he would destroy the post with everyone inside. Velkun started to argue about galactic law and human authority. Jake cut the transmission and started counting down. 8 minutes later, Keltharian personnel began evacuating in small escape pods. Jake ordered them tractored aboard the Vengeance and placed in the brig. When the facility was empty, he gave the order to fire. The Vengeance's main guns reduced the observation post to debris in seconds. Jake watched the destruction on his screen and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just cold purpose. Nicole made a note in the ship's log. First enemy installation destroyed. First prisoners taken. They set course back to base. Admiral Blake received Jake's report along with dozens of others from across the fleet. Human ships were engaging Keltharian forces throughout the border regions. Most encounters ended quickly in humanity's favor. The Keltharians seemed unprepared for actual combat with Earth. Their ships were designed to intimidate rather than fight peer opponents. Blake studied the data and began forming a larger strategy. The Keltharians had numbers and territory. Humanity had motivation and innovation. He needed to leverage those advantages. Dr. Helen Carter completed her first major weapons project 2 months into the war. She called it the Hammer Protocol. The principle was simple but devastating. Tungsten rods accelerated to relativistic speeds could destroy almost anything they hit. The kinetic energy alone was equivalent to nuclear weapons, but without the radiation or political complications. Helen watched the first test firing from an observation station and saw an unmanned target ship simply cease to exist. The rod passed through it like it wasn't there. She went back to her quarters and cried for an hour before returning to work. The Keltharians began to realize they had miscalculated. Reports reached their high command of ships disappearing and outposts going silent. Commander Jelthar, the officer who had ordered the New Virginia attack, reviewed the information with growing concern. He had expected humanity to collapse under pressure or beg for mercy. Instead, they were fighting with a ferocity that seemed impossible for a species so young to space warfare. He requested reinforcements and authorization to use heavier weapons. The High Command granted both. Jake Morrison's reputation grew with each successful mission. The Vengeance and 2 sister ships under his tactical command formed a wolf pack that hunted Keltharian vessels throughout human space. They specialized in hit-and-run attacks that left no survivors to report their methods. Other crews started calling Jake's group the Ghost Squadron. The name stuck. Keltharian communications intercepted by Earth intelligence showed that aliens were beginning to fear certain sectors of space. Jake felt satisfaction at that. Let them feel fear. Let them understand what they had created. The first major fleet engagement happened near the colony of New Haven. Keltharian intelligence had identified it as weakly defended. They assembled 50 warships to attack and destroy the colony as they had New Virginia. What they didn't know was that Admiral Blake had anticipated exactly this move. He positioned the first fleet in the nearby nebula with all ships running silent. When the Keltharian force arrived at New Haven, they found the colony evacuated and Blake's ships waiting. Blake gave the order, and the first fleet emerged from the nebula like sharks from dark water. The Hammer Protocol was authorized for the first time in actual combat. Tungsten rods launched from hidden positions tore through the Keltharian formation before they could react. 37 enemy ships were destroyed in the opening 40 seconds. The remaining vessels tried to scatter, but human ships pursued with ruthless efficiency. The battle lasted 2 hours. When it ended, not a single Keltharian ship escaped. Blake's fleet suffered 12 damaged vessels and no losses. The news of the New Haven victory spread across Earth like wildfire. People celebrated in the streets for the first time since the war began. It wasn't joy exactly, but relief. Proof that humanity could win. Proof that New Virginia would be avenged. Karen Hughes addressed the planet again, and her voice carried strength that had been missing since the attack. They were winning. The path ahead would be long and painful, but victory was possible. Commander Jelthar received the report of the New Haven disaster with disbelief. He read it 3 times trying to understand how 50 warships could be destroyed so completely. The descriptions of human weapons seemed exaggerated. Nothing should be able to punch through Keltharian shields that easily. He requested full tactical recordings from any surviving sensors. What he saw made his blood run cold. The humans hadn't just won. They had executed a perfect ambush using weapons his species had never encountered. He began to understand that this war would not be quick or easy. Jake Morrison was promoted to captain after his wolf pack successfully raided a Keltharian supply depot deep in enemy territory. The raid had been considered nearly suicidal, but Jake's planning and his crew's execution made it look routine. They destroyed 6 months' worth of supplies and escaped without taking damage. Admiral Blake personally delivered Jake's new rank insignia and asked him to dinner. Over a meal of reconstituted protein and recycled water, Blake asked Jake his opinion of the war's progress. Jake considered his answer carefully. They were winning battles, but the Keltharians had vast resources and territory. This could last years or even decades if Earth didn't press their advantages aggressively. Blake nodded and revealed he was thinking the same thing. The Keltharians needed to be taught a lesson they would never forget. Not just defeated, but broken so thoroughly they would never threaten humanity again. Jake agreed without hesitation. For Amy and her daughters, for all 40,000 dead, for every human who had suffered under Keltharian cruelty. Dr. Helen Carter began work on even more advanced weapons systems. The Hammer protocol had proven devastatingly effective, but she knew they needed more options. Her team explored everything from exotic particles to gravitational manipulation. Some ideas were brilliant, some were insane, a few were both. Helen approved research into all of them. In war, she learned, you used every tool available. Morality became a luxury they couldn't afford. She tried not to think about what her younger self would say about that. 6 months into the war, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. Keltharian forces were on the defensive across multiple sectors. Human ships operated freely in areas that had been considered enemy territory. The blockades around human colonies were broken. Trade resumed. Families were reunited. But Earth's leadership knew this was just the beginning. The Keltharians still held their core territories and massive fleet reserves. The real test was yet to come. Admiral Blake began planning for an offensive that would take the war deep into the heart of the Keltharian Empire. Victory would require not just defeating their military, but breaking their will to fight. Jake Morrison and thousands like him prepared themselves for what lay ahead. They had shown the galaxy one side of humanity. Now it was time to show them the rest. The war entered its second year with a shift that terrified the Keltharian Empire. Human ships no longer waited for enemy vessels to approach their territory. Instead, they hunted across the stars like predators that had caught the scent of blood. Keltharian patrols began disappearing with alarming frequency. A cruiser would report its position and then simply vanish. Supply convoys never reached their destinations. Listening posts went silent mid-transmission. The pattern repeated across dozens of systems until the Keltharians realized they were the ones being hunted now. Captain Jake Morrison commanded a battle group that had become legendary among both human and alien forces. His carrier group consisted of the UES Vengeance, 2 destroyers, and a stealth frigate equipped with Dr. Helen Carter's latest sensor masking technology. They operated in Keltharian space for weeks at a time without being detected. The aliens had started calling him the Shadow in their intercepted communications. Jake found dark amusement in that. Shadows were exactly what his ships had become. The raid on Keltharis Prime's third moon was planned over 6 weeks. Intelligence reports indicated the moon housed the Empire's primary plutonium refinement facility. 90% of their weapons-grade material came from that single location. Admiral Blake gave Jake the mission personally with a simple instruction: make it hurt. Jake studied the target until he could navigate the facility in his sleep. His crew ran simulations until every movement was muscle memory. When they finally made the jump into the system, everyone knew their role perfectly. They approached the moon using a trajectory that kept them hidden behind the system's gas giant. The stealth systems made them nearly invisible, but Jake took no chances. Nicole Hayes monitored every sensor sweep from the Keltharian defense platforms. She counted the seconds between scans and calculated the gaps they could exploit. When she gave the signal, all 4 ships accelerated toward the moon at maximum burn. They had exactly 8 minutes before the next sensor sweep. The attack itself lasted 11 minutes from first shot to final detonation. Jake's ships emerged from behind the moon already firing. The defense platforms never had time to raise shields. Tungsten rods from the Hammer Protocol turned the refinement facility into a crater half a mile deep. Secondary explosions rippled across the moon's surface as stored plutonium went critical. Jake's tactical officer estimated they had just destroyed enough weapons-grade material to build 5,000 warheads. The Keltharians would feel this loss for years. As his ships accelerated away from the moon, Jake activated a communications beacon they had planted in orbit. It began broadcasting on all Keltharian military frequencies. The message was simple and repeated in their language. "We tried peace." The 4 ships vanished into dark space before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Later, intelligence reports indicated the Keltharians had diverted ships from 3 other sectors to protect their remaining refinement facilities. Jake smiled when he heard that. Every ship protecting a facility was one less ship hunting human colonies. Commander Jelthar stood in the Keltharian High Command chamber and tried to explain how they had lost their primary weapons facility. The assembled leaders stared at him with expressions that ranged from disbelief to rage. How could 4 human ships penetrate their defenses so easily? How could they destroy a facility that had operated safely for 2 centuries? Jelthar had no good answers. He showed them the tactical recordings and watched their faces go pale. The humans fought with precision that seemed impossible. Every shot counted. Every movement served a purpose. They wasted nothing. The High Command demanded new strategies. Jelthar proposed massing their fleets for overwhelming force rather than spreading them thin across their territory. The humans were using guerrilla tactics precisely because they had fewer ships. If the Keltharians concentrated their power, they could crush any human force they encountered. The leaders approved his plan and authorized the withdrawal of ships from conquered territories. Subject species across the Empire watched Keltharian forces pull back and began to wonder if their masters were not as invincible as they claimed. On Earth, the war had transformed society in ways both obvious and subtle. Factory stations in orbit ran 3 shifts producing warships and weapons. The economy had fully converted to military production, but people still had jobs and food and purpose. Crime rates had dropped to historic lows. Political divisions that had seemed insurmountable before the war faded into irrelevance. Humanity had found unity in shared struggle. Dr. Helen Carter worked 20-hour days and barely noticed. Her team had become her family and the laboratory her home. Nicole Hayes received her promotion to commander and her own ship command 14 months into the war. The UES Retribution was a heavy cruiser equipped with the latest weapon systems. Her crew was handpicked from volunteers who had proven themselves in combat. When she took the captain's chair for the first time, she felt her husband's absence like a physical weight. He should have been here to see this. She pushed the thought away and focused on her new responsibilities. Grief was a luxury she would indulge after the war ended. The liberation of Theta Coronae became Nicole's first major mission as captain. The planet was home to the Vorian species, peaceful traders who had been conquered by the Keltharians a decade earlier. Intelligence indicated the Vorians were being used as slave labor in mining operations. Nicole received authorization to liberate the planet if possible without causing excessive Vorian casualties. She studied the orbital defenses and developed a plan that was risky, but had a chance of working. Nicole's attack group consisted of 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers. They jumped into the Theta Coronae system and immediately launched every fighter and drone they had. The swarm of small craft overwhelmed the Keltharian sensor systems. While the defenders focused on the fighters, Nicole's cruisers accelerated toward the orbital stations from an unexpected vector. They opened fire at point-blank range with devastating effect. The Keltharian defense fleet tried to respond, but they were positioned to defend against attack from the jump point, not from within the system itself. The battle for Theta Coronae lasted 6 hours. Nicole's ships fought with controlled egress. Cyan, taking calculated risks that paid off more often than not. When the last Keltharian vessel was disabled, she ordered her Marines to begin boarding operations on the orbital stations. The Vorians imprisoned there were terrified at first, expecting new masters to replace old ones. Nicole went down to the largest station personally to address them. She stood before thousands of freed slaves and told them the truth. Earth sought no empire. They were free to govern themselves. Humanity asked only for friendship if they chose to give it. The Vorians wept openly as they listened. Some fell to their knees. Others embraced each other with disbelief and joy. Their leader, an elderly Vorian named Keth, approached Nicole and asked what humanity wanted in return for this gift of freedom. Nicole's answer was honest. She told them that humans had learned the price of allowing bullies to go unchecked. If the Vorians wanted to repay Earth, they should help ensure no species ever suffered under Keltharian tyranny again. Keth agreed without hesitation. Within weeks, Vorian ships were joining human patrols and Vorian intelligence was helping identify Keltharian targets. The Keltharian High Command watched their empire begin to crack. Subject species were rebelling. Trade routes were collapsing. Planets that had paid tribute for generations were declaring independence. Xelthar argued desperately for negotiation. They needed to end this war before it destroyed everything the Empire had built, but pride ran deep in the High Command. They sent Ambassador Kelnara to Earth with offers of peace talks. She carried authorization to negotiate everything except complete surrender. Chancellor Karen Hughes received the Keltharian ambassador in a conference room overlooking the ruins of Geneva. Parts of the city still showed scars from a Keltharian raid early in the war. Karen had chosen this location deliberately. She wanted Kelnara to see what her people had done. The ambassador arrived with a delegation of diplomats and security personnel. They all looked nervous. Karen noted that with satisfaction. Let them feel uncertain. Let them wonder what came next. Kelnara began with formal apologies for misunderstandings and tragic mistakes. She spoke of cultural differences and communication failures. She offered economic partnerships and technology sharing. She suggested mutual defense agreements and cultural exchange programs. Karen listened in silence until the ambassador finished. Then she activated a screen on the wall. The image showed New Virginia before the attack. Children playing in parks. Families working in gardens. People living normal lives filled with small joys and daily struggles. Karen let the images play for 5 minutes while Kelnara and her delegation watched in uncomfortable silence. Then she switched to footage from after the bombardment, the crater where a city had been, the search teams finding nothing but ash and melted metal, the memorial services where parents buried empty caskets because there was nothing left to bury. Karen let that play for 5 minutes as well. When she finally paused the screen, she turned to Kelnara with eyes that held no warmth. "Did you show mercy to them?" Karen asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Kelnara tried to speak about military necessity and unfortunate escalation. Karen cut her off with a gesture. She presented Earth's terms for peace: complete and unconditional surrender, war crimes tribunals for everyone involved in attacks on civilians, full reparations to be determined by an independent council, permanent dismantling of the Keltharian military beyond a small defense force, independence for all subject species currently under Keltharian rule. The terms were harsh and non-negotiable. Kelnara's face showed shock and then anger. She argued that the High Command would never accept such humiliation. The Keltharian Empire had existed for 1,000 years. They would not simply cease to exist because humanity demanded it. Karen's response was cold and final. "Then the war continues until your empire is nothing but a memory. You came to us offering friendship and answered with violence. You had 15 years to choose peace. You chose this. Now you live with the consequences." The meeting ended with Kelnara storming out, and her delegation scrambling to follow. Jake Morrison received news of the failed negotiations, while his battle group was resupplying at a forward base. He was not surprised. The Keltharians still believed they could win, or at least negotiate from strength. They needed to learn that neither option existed anymore. Admiral Blake was apparently thinking the same thing because new orders arrived within hours. Jake's group and 15 others were being combined into a strike force with a single objective: take the war to Keltharis Prime itself, show the Keltharians that nowhere was safe, make them understand that humanity would accept nothing less than total victory. 2 years had passed since New Virginia burned, and the galaxy had learned to fear humanity. Keltharian ships no longer patrolled openly but instead huddled in defensive formations around their core worlds. Their empire, which had once spanned 200 systems, had contracted to less than 50. Subject species had broken free in waves, many of them forming alliance with Earth. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone knew it except perhaps the Keltharian High Command itself, Captain. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance and studied the tactical display showing the gathering human fleet. Ships arrived through the jump point in steady streams, carriers and battleships and cruisers and destroyers, each one representing years of construction and training and preparation. Admiral Blake was assembling the largest military force in human history for a single purpose. They were going to Keltheris Prime. They were going to end this war. Jake's reputation had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Other captains sought his advice on tactics. New recruits studied his battles in training simulations. The media called him a hero, though he never felt like one. Heroes saved people. Jake just killed the enemy with efficiency, born from rage that had cooled into something colder and more dangerous. Nicole Hayes told him once that he scared her sometimes with how calm he remained during combat. Jake took that as a compliment. The fleet grew to 300 ships over 2 weeks. It represented nearly half of Earth's total military strength, concentrated in one place. Admiral Blake called a conference of all senior officers to outline the battle plan. Jake sat in a room with 100 other captains and listened as Blake explained what was expected of them. The Keltharian home fleet guarded their capital world with over 500 ships. The humans would be outnumbered, but Blake believed their technological advantages and superior tactics would carry the day. Dr. Helen Carter arrived at the fleet staging area with her latest creation. She called it the Phantom Drive, and it represented a breakthrough in stealth technology. Ships equipped with it could effectively disappear from sensors even while maneuvering at combat speeds. The catch was that it consumed enormous power and could only run for short periods. Blake ordered it installed on 50 destroyers and frigates. These ships would form an invisible vanguard that could strike from positions the enemy would never expect. Commander Nicole Hayes commanded a cruiser squadron assigned to the fleet's left flank. Her ships had been upgraded with improved shields and weapons during the refit period. She walked through the Retribution's corridors and saw determination on every face. Her crew had been through a dozen major battles together. They moved with the confidence of veterans who knew their jobs and trusted each other. Nicole felt pride in what they had become even as she mourned what war had cost them all. The Keltharian High Command received intelligence reports about the human fleet gathering near their borders. Commander Jelthar read the numbers with growing dread. 300 warships was more than he had believed humanity could produce. They had been at war for only 2 years and already matched the Keltharian construction output of a decade. He presented the information to the High Command and begged them to reconsider negotiations. The response was anger at his defeatism. The Empire would never bow to primitives regardless of their temporary advantages. Jelthar was given command of the home fleet as punishment for his pessimism. The High Command believed putting him in charge of the defense would force him to fight rather than talk. He accepted the assignment knowing it might be a death sentence. 500 ships was an impressive force, but the humans had shown repeatedly that numbers alone meant nothing. He began organizing his vessels into defensive formations and tried to anticipate where the enemy would strike. Every simulation he ran ended with heavy casualties on both sides. None showed a clear Keltharian victory. The human fleet jumped into the Keltheris system on a Tuesday morning Earth time. They emerged at the outer edge of the system, far from the planet but well within sensor range. Admiral Blake wanted the Keltharians to see them coming. He wanted them to feel the weight of what was approaching. The fleet formed into attack formation with parade ground precision. 300 ships moving as one toward the heart of the enemy empire. It was meant to terrify, and it worked. Jelthar watched the human fleet advance and felt something close to despair. They came on steadily without hesitation or doubt. His own ships held position around Keltheris Prime as ordered. The High Command insisted the humans would break and run when faced with the full might of the home fleet. Jelthar knew better. These humans had chased his people across the galaxy for 2 years. They had not come this far to turn back now. He opened communications and tried one final time to negotiate. Blake's response was to cut the transmission without a word. Chancellor Karen Hughes broadcast her message as the fleets closed to weapons range. It went out on all frequencies in every language humanity had translated. She spoke not with anger but with the cold certainty of justice finally arriving. Her words were measured and clear as she recounted the history of humanity's contact with the Keltharian Empire. She listed every diplomatic attempt over 15 years. She named the dead of New Virginia. She showed images of the crater where a city had been. "We are not a warlike species," Karen said as the fleets moved closer together. "We reached for the stars hoping to find friends and partners in this vast universe. We extended our hand in friendship and you answered with violence. You mistook our desire for peace as weakness. You learned too late that humanity's greatest strength is not our capacity for war. It is our capacity to choose it only when all other options are exhausted." She paused and her voice grew harder. "This is our final message. We tried peace. You chose this path." The Battle of Keltharis Prime began at 8:47 hours with the human fleet launching fighters and drones in a massive wave. Thousands of small craft screamed toward the Keltharian lines while the capital ships held formation behind them. Jelthar ordered his point defense systems to engage and watched helplessly as the human craft scattered and weaved through the defensive fire. They were not attacking but drawing fire and attention. He realized the mistake a second before the real assault began. 50 human ships equipped with phantom drives materialized inside his defensive perimeter. They had approached while cloaked and now opened fire at point-blank range. The Keltharian formation dissolved into chaos as ships tried to respond to threats from within their own ranks. Jake Morrison's carrier group was among the phantom ships. His destroyers tore through a Keltharian cruiser squadron before they could raise shields. The UES Vengeance launched its full complement of fighters directly into the enemy formation. It was brutal and efficient and exactly what Blake had planned. Nicole Hayes led her squadron in a hammer blow against the Keltharian right flank. Her ships came in fast and low, using the planet's gravity well to increase their speed. The enemy vessels tried to reposition, but human weapons had longer range and hit harder. Nicole's tactical officer called out targets and her gunners destroyed them with methodical precision. One Keltharian battleship, then another, then 3 destroyers in quick succession. The Retribution shook from return fire, but the shields held. Nicole ordered evasive maneuvers and her helmsman danced the massive cruiser through incoming fire like it was a fighter. Admiral Blake commanded from the UES Defiant at the center of the human formation. He watched the battle develop across multiple screens and made adjustments in real time. When he saw the Keltharian left flank weakening, he ordered a full assault in that sector. When their center tried to collapse on his phantom ships, he rotated his battleships to provide covering fire. The human fleet moved like a living thing, responding to his commands. Years of training and simulation were paying off in the largest battle humanity had ever fought. Jelthar tried desperately to rally his fleet, but the humans were everywhere at once. His communications were jammed. His sensors showed conflicting information. Ships reported damage and losses faster than he could process. The home fleet outnumbered the enemy, but they were being torn apart by superior coordination and weapons. He watched a human destroyer dodge fire from 3 of his cruisers and return fire that crippled 2 of them. He saw human fighters swarm a Keltharian carrier and reduce it to scrap in minutes. This was not a battle. It was an execution. Jake Morrison's battle group pushed deeper into the Keltharian formation. His orders were to break their command structure, and he pursued that goal with single-minded focus. Enemy command ships were larger and more heavily armed, but they were also slower and less maneuverable. Jake's destroyers hit them with tungsten rods that punched through their shields like paper. One command ship exploded in a fireball visible from the planet below. Another lost power and began drifting. A third tried to run, but Nicole's squadron cut off its escape and disabled it with precise fire. The battle raged for 18 hours. Human ships rotated in and out of combat to rearm and repair, while Keltharian forces had no such luxury. Fresh human squadrons replaced tired ones while the enemy grew increasingly disorganized. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the ratio favored humanity 3-1. Keltharian ships began breaking formation to retreat. Some made it to jump distance. Most did not. Admiral Blake gave pursuit orders but did not press too hard. He wanted survivors to carry word of what happened here. Jelthar's flagship took a direct hit that knocked out main power. Emergency systems kept life support running, but weapons and engines were gone. He sat in the darkened command center and watched his fleet disintegrate on backup displays. 500 ships reduced to less than 200 in a single day. The home fleet, pride of the Keltharian Empire, had been broken by a species they had dismissed as primitive. He finally understood what humanity had tried to tell them for 15 years. Some species fight because they love war. Others fight because you give them no choice. The second kind is far more dangerous. Admiral Blake ordered ceasefire as Keltharian resistance collapsed. Human ships held position around Keltharis Prime with weapons trained on the planet below. The orbital defense platforms were destroyed. The home fleet was scattered or destroyed. Nothing stood between Earth's forces and the Keltharian homeworld. Blake opened a communication channel to the planet's surface. His message was simple. The Keltharian High Command had 1 hour to surrender unconditionally, or he would begin orbital bombardment. He did not want to kill civilians, but he would do whatever was necessary to end this war. The hour passed in silence. 300 human warships surrounded Keltherus Prime like a steel noose waiting to tighten. Admiral Blake sat in his command chair and watched the countdown. Part of him hoped the Keltharian High Command would refuse so he could finish what they started. Another part, the part that remembered who he had been before the war, hoped they would see reason. Either way, this ended today. The timer reached 0 and Blake opened the communication channel again. He did not have to wait long for a response. The Keltharian High Command surrendered at 0312 hours. Their message was brief and contained none of the arrogance that had marked their earlier communications. They agreed to all terms without condition or negotiation. Blake acknowledged the surrender and ordered his Marines to prepare for landing operations. Captain Jake Morrison volunteered his crew for the initial landing force. Blake approved the request. Jake had earned the right to be there when this war officially ended. Jake led 200 Marines down to the planet's surface in armored dropships. They landed outside the High Command building in the capital city. Keltharian civilians watched from windows and doorways with expressions of fear and disbelief. Their empire had stood for 1,000 years. Now it was ending because they had attacked the wrong species. Jake walked through the streets with his rifle ready, but no one offered resistance. The Keltharian military police had already disarmed and surrendered to avoid further bloodshed. The High Command waited in their council chamber. 12 Keltharian leaders who had ruled an empire spanning hundreds of worlds now sat in silence as human soldiers surrounded them. Jake entered the chamber and saw fear in their eyes. Good, he thought. Let them feel what the colonists felt. Let them understand terror in their final moments of power. But Jake was not here for revenge. He was here to accept their surrender and ensure the terms were followed. He gestured and his Marines began securing the building. Commander Jelthar was brought before Jake in restraints. The Keltharian officer who had ordered the New Virginia attack stood quietly as Jake studied him. Jelthar looked older than his years, worn down by defeat and guilt. He met Jake's eyes without flinching and spoke in careful English. He said he was ready to face judgment for his crimes. Jake felt rage rise in his chest like fire. This creature had killed his sister and nieces, had murdered 40,000 innocent people. Jake's hand moved to his sidearm without conscious thought. Nicole Hayes stepped forward and placed her hand on Jake's arm. She had been his first officer through the entire war. She had lost her husband the same day Jake lost his family. Her voice was quiet but firm as she reminded him that this was not vengeance but justice. Jelthar would face trial for his crimes. He would answer for every death. But they would not become murderers in the pursuit of justice. Jake's hand moved away from his weapon. He ordered Jelthar taken into custody for transport to Earth. The Keltharian was led away without resistance. The war crimes tribunals began 6 months later. Hundreds of Keltharian officers and officials were brought before international courts on Earth. The trials were broadcast across the galaxy so every species could see that humanity sought justice rather than revenge. Jelthar and the High Command members were found guilty of crimes against sentient beings. Their sentences ranged from life imprisonment to execution, depending on their individual crimes. Jelthar received a death sentence, but it was stayed pending appeal. He would spend the rest of his life in prison instead. The Keltharian Empire was dismantled piece by piece. Their military was reduced to a defense force capable only of system patrol. Their government was restructured under oversight from a council of liberated species. Subject races that had suffered under their rule gained independence and representation. Reparations were established with payment schedules that would take generations to complete. The species that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries was reduced to a single star system and strict limitations on expansion. Chancellor Karen Hughes stood before the United Nations 5 years after the war ended. She was older now, with gray in her hair that had not been there before. The cost of leadership during wartime showed in the lines on her face. She spoke about the lessons humanity had learned. They had reached for the stars seeking friendship and found cruelty instead. They had responded with a strength they had not known they possessed. Now they faced the harder task of building peace from the ashes of war. Captain Jake Morrison returned to New Virginia for the first time since the attack. The crater was still there, too large to fill, too deep to forget. But around its edges, construction had begun. A new city was rising, built by survivors and volunteers from across human space. In the center of the crater stood a memorial carved from black stone. 40,000 names were inscribed in letters small enough to fit them all but large enough to read. Jake found his sister's name and those of his nieces. He placed flowers at the base of the memorial and stood in silence. Admiral Nicole Hayes stood beside Jake at the memorial. She had been promoted after the war ended and now commanded Earth's Second Fleet. Her responsibilities kept her busy, but she made time to come here today. She and Jake did not speak. There were no words adequate for what they both felt. The dead were gone but not forgotten. The scars remained even as life moved forward. They stayed at the memorial until the sun set, and then walked together back to the landing pad where their shuttle waited. Dr. Helen Carter dismantled her weapons laboratory piece by piece. The war was over and she wanted no part of creating more tools of destruction. Some of her team argued that they should keep researching in case another threat emerged. Helen refused. Humanity had proven it could defend itself when necessary. Now it was time to remember that they were explorers and scientists before they were warriors. She accepted a position at the rebuilt colony of New Virginia, teaching physics to the next generation. It felt like penance and redemption combined. Earth's military began a gradual drawdown after the initial occupation forces were established. Ships were mothballed or converted to civilian use. Soldiers returned home to families they had not seen in years. The economy slowly shifted back toward peaceful production. It would take decades to fully recover, but humanity had survived. They had faced extinction and fought their way back to security. The cost had been terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. The Vorian species, liberated early in the war, became humanity's strongest allies. They joined Earth's growing confederation of free worlds and contributed both ships and resources to peacekeeping efforts. Other species freed from Keltharian rule followed suit. Within a decade, humanity found itself at the center of an alliance that spanned 100 systems. They had sought friends among the stars and finally found them, though not in the way they had imagined. Ambassador Lisa Grant, who had led the first contact mission so many years ago, returned to diplomatic service. She was an old woman now, but her mind remained sharp and her dedication unwavering. She led negotiations with new species encountered on the expanding frontier. Her first question to each new contact was always the same: "Do you come in peace?" If they said yes, she offered genuine friendship and partnership. If they hesitated, she made sure they understood the history of the Keltharian War. Most chose friendship. Jake Morrison took command of the UES New Dawn 10 years after the war ended. The ship was the Explorer-class vessel designed for long-range survey missions. It carried no weapons beyond basic defensive systems. The crew was composed of scientists and explorers rather than soldiers. Jake stood on the bridge as they prepared for their first mission and felt something he had not felt in over a decade. Hope. The galaxy was vast and mostly unexplored. There were wonders waiting to be discovered and friends waiting to be made. The New Dawn's mission took them to the far reaches of unexplored space. They mapped new star systems and cataloged alien life. They made contact with 3 new species in their first year. All 3 encounters were peaceful. Jake found himself negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchanges rather than battle tactics. It was strange at first, but gradually it felt right. This was what humanity had always meant to do. The war had been necessary, but it was not who they were. Nicole Hayes visited Jake during a resupply stop at a frontier station. She brought news from Earth and stories about her own missions. Her fleet patrolled the borders, ensuring that the peace held. There had been a few incidents with pirates and smugglers, but nothing that required serious military action. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity preferred peace but could wage war with terrible efficiency when forced. Most species chose to work with humans rather than against them. The 2 old friends sat in a quiet bar on the station and talked about everything except the war. They discussed their crews and their missions and their hopes for the future. Nicole mentioned that she was considering retirement in a few years. She wanted to teach at the academy and help train the next generation of officers. Jake nodded and said he might do the same eventually. For now, though, he was content exploring and discovering. The galaxy held too many wonders to stop just yet. Earth itself had transformed in the years since the war. The unity forged in conflict had not faded entirely. Politics still existed and people still disagreed, but there was an underlying sense of shared purpose that had not existed before. Humanity knew what they could accomplish when they worked together. They knew the price of division and the value of cooperation. Children learned about the Keltharian War in school, but they also learned about the peace that followed. Both lessons mattered. Chancellor Karen Hughes retired after 15 years in office. She was succeeded by a younger leader who had been a child during the war. The transition was peaceful and orderly. Karen gave one final speech on her last day. She spoke about the responsibility that came with power. Humanity had proven itself capable of terrible destruction. Now they had to prove themselves worthy of the peace they had won. The galaxy was watching, and history would judge them by what they built, rather than what they destroyed. The memorial on New Virginia became a pilgrimage site for humans across the galaxy. People came to remember and to honor those who had died, but they also came to see the new city growing around the crater. Life continued. Children played in parks built on land that had once been a battlefield. Schools taught students who had been born after the war ended. The dead were remembered, but the living moved forward. It was what those who died would have wanted. Jake Morrison stood at the memorial one final time before the new dawn departed on a mission that would last several years. He placed his hand on the black stone and felt the names carved beneath his fingers. His sister and nieces were at peace now. The war that took them had ended and justice had been served. The galaxy had learned that humanity offered friendship first, but would not hesitate to defend itself when threatened. It was a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. The final message echoed across the stars in 1,000 languages. It played on communication networks and was carved into monuments on liberated worlds. We tried peace. Those 3 words contained both a warning and a promise. Humanity preferred peace and would pursue it with endless patience. But when that peace was answered with violence, they would respond with everything they had. The other side of humanity, the warrior side, existed not from love of war, but from love of those they protected. Earth looked out at the galaxy with clear eyes and open hands. They had been tested and survived. They had fought and won. Now they built and explored and dreamed of tomorrow. The species that had reached for the stars hoping to find friends had found enemies first. But in defeating those enemies, they had found genuine friends among the liberated and the grateful. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, but humanity had proven they belonged among the stars. They had tried peace, and when that failed, they had shown the galaxy exactly what humans were capable of when pushed too far.